Thanks for joining me. I'm Aaron Rutten, and today I'm going to be challenging myself to create a painting using only 3 custom brushes. Let's take a look at what the brushes look like. The first is Glow Knife, and this is kind of a flat palette knife brush that builds up into this nice glowing light. The second brush is called Lightning Pen. The color from this brush comes from the gradient that you have selected, so if I choose main to additional color for my gradient, I can choose a main and an additional color, meaning I can paint with multicolored strokes. Now I can choose any gradient preset I like here, but if I want the lightning bolt effect, I need to choose this custom gradient I created called Lightning. And now you can see that I get the right kind of gradient. Now you'll want to make your brush on the smaller side, otherwise you get this jagged pixelation, which you may or may not like. So smaller tends to work better, but lightning bolts tend to be rather thin anyways. So you can just draw a branching pattern like this. If you use heavier pressure, you can get a thicker lightning bolt. If you use lighter pressure, you get thinner lightning bolts. And the third brush is found in Particles Glow Effects. It's called Rotation Jet, and it creates this burst of light that emanates from a single point. It's a particle brush, so it's going to kind of go in random directions. So you may find it a little bit unruly. These glow brushes work better if you choose a darker color like I'm doing here. So if I want kind of a flame, I could choose kind of a dark orange like this. And you could also draw with the edge of the brush if you wanted something like a mountain. So you can really get a lot of versatility out of this brush. But what's really neat about this brush is if you have the Wacom Art Pen that senses barrel rotation, you can rotate the angle of this particle brush. So you can make these particles emanate out going a certain direction. So I'm just rotating the barrel of my pen right now, and I'm rotating the angle that the particles are spraying out. I suspect that this brush is going to be the most difficult to use in my challenge, but I'll find a place for it. If you don't have a Wacom Art Pen with rotation, you can also manually transform these to change the angle as well. So those are the brushes. Let's take a look and see if I can create a painting using only these 3 brushes. Feel free to follow along if you like. You can download these brushes at aaronrutten.com. I'll put a link in the video description. So I'm going to paint kind of a lightning landscape at night. I'm going to fill my canvas with a medium blue color to start out, and I've created a new layer above that, and I'll go ahead and use that to draw in some of the details here so I can kind of compose this as I go along. I'm going to select a dark blue along with the glow knife. And I'll just use that as a palette knife to put in some islands or cliffs or hills or mountains. Now this brush tends to be pretty wide, so you're going to want to make a really small brush if you want to be able to draw small shapes like this. But I'm just painting kind of with the edge of the brush. Now I have a reference photo that I'm going to be working from loosely here just to give me an idea of kind of where to place things and some colors I might want to use. But I'm also just going to be improvising quite a bit. The shape that I'm drawing here isn't the exact shape in the reference photo, but I know I want some big pieces of land kind of sticking out here in the corners. I'm going to go ahead and name this layer Cliffs Foreground. These could be cliffs or hills or mountains or whatever. I'm just giving it a name so that I know what it is. FG stands for foreground because there's going to be multiple layers of these cliffs. Might even make this a bit more interesting by adding a little island and some little peninsulas. I'm going to separate everything into layers, so I'll create a layer beneath that for the horizon, and I'll use that to put in a nice horizon here. I'm holding down Shift, and I'm using that glow knife along with a dark orange. I'll set that layer to a screen composite method, and I can put in some different orange and yellow and red colors here near the horizon. That'll look like cars off in the distance. Maybe it's the headlights and the taillights in a long exposure. I also want to create some layers of hills. I'll have some in the middle here. I'll go ahead and just keep using that same glow knife brush. Anywhere where I overpainted, I can just trim that off with a selection. And I'll go ahead and just adjust the composite method to multiply and maybe play with the opacity. I'll create another layer of hills behind that, and I'll fill that in the same way. And again, I'll just make sure to set the opacity and the composite method. That way I can just set this back behind the other hills. Next, I'll return to that canvas layer, which is where my sky is located, and I'm going to create some light emanating from where the lightning bolt is going to come out of. Now you can see I'm experimenting until I get the effect that I want with this brush. This is a palette knife, so you normally wouldn't use it this way. I'm putting in some detail in the sky here. Now I can go ahead and drop that sky detail onto the canvas layer, so I'm basically just merging it with the canvas. And then I'll add a soften effect to go ahead and blur that sky. That'll essentially blend, that way I'm not selecting a blender since I don't have a blender for either of these 3 brushes. This is my only option. I'll bring back a little bit more sharpness with that glow knife and just go ahead and add more contrast to the edge of the cloud as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and move on to the water layer, and I'll use this glow knife for the water. This is where the glow knife really shines, no pun intended. But you can see it works really well to build up these nice ripples in the water. I'm using different colors from the sky and lighter blues. It's really just working nicely here. If you want to put your darker ripples on a separate multiply layer, you could do that as well. It doesn't hurt to separate things. And that way you can play with the opacity of that layer as well. Next, I'll lighten the sky near the hill edges with the glow knife. Then I'll go ahead and just merge those water layers together onto the canvas layer with the sky. That'll just make it easier to work between those two areas of the painting without having to switch between layers. Since they're divided by those hills, I'm not too worried about too much overlap. So I'm just going to continue reflecting some of the sky colors into the water here using the glow knife. Now it's time to add some lightning. I'll go ahead and do that on a new layer. Of course, I'm going to use the lightning pen for that, and I want to make sure I have the lightning gradient selected. I'll just draw in my lightning bolts here. I'll do the main bolts first, and then I'll have some little arms coming off of those. I'll create a new layer that I'll set to screen as well, and I'll go ahead and use a bigger version of this brush just to put some glow right along the edge of those main bolts. I'll go ahead and add a soften effect to go ahead and blend that up so it's not so jagged looking. Then I'll reflect some of that lightning glow into the water. I want to use the glow knife for that. I'll also add more glow in the sky near the lightning bolts, and I'll reflect that in the water as well. Now because I'm just kind of improvising here, I didn't get the hills exactly the way I want them, so I'm going to go ahead and just clean them up a bit. I'll turn on preserve transparency. I'm going to go ahead and just fill those hills with a solid color. That way it's not so wonky looking. I think that looks pretty good. I'll go ahead and do that with the hills in front of that as well. I just want to get a nice balance between light and dark here so there's enough contrast. I want the hills that are farther away to be a bit lighter and a bit more muted, and as they move into the foreground, they get a bit darker. Now I don't want those hills to be flat, so I do want to add some shading. It's going to be a little bit tricky given the brushes I have to choose from, so I'm going to go ahead and do select layer content on the outline of that layer. I'll just create a new layer above it that I can paint my texture or my form onto. I'll go ahead and set that to screen. Now at this point I haven't found anything to use rotation jet for. I could try to use it for the texture on the hills here, but I don't think I like that. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm just going to continue using the glow knife. I don't want to overdo it. I really just want to try to separate the hills from each other with a little bit of light mist. And I'll just merge that texture down with the hills beneath it. I'll also deselect my selection with Control D, and if I turn on transparency on that hills mid layer, you can get basically the same effect. It's just my texture won't be separate, and so if I mess it up, then I may have to go ahead and refill my hills again. So you could really do it either way. Now I'll go ahead and return to the sky, and I'm going to go ahead and clean up the edge of the clouds where the lightning is emanating from. And I want to make sure that I'm choosing main to additional color for my gradient. You could also use main color to transparent, but I'm actually pleasantly surprised about how well this brush works for clouds, even though it's obviously a lightning brush. If you use it in the right way, it also gives you a nice cloudy effect. That's really one of the benefits to experimenting like this with these art challenges. Now I'm going to add some contrast to the edges of the mountain where they meet the sky, just by making it a bit lighter on the sky layer. Maybe the lightning is coming out of the sky and that light is bouncing up off of those distant hills, and you might be able to see some of that. I'm going to continue using that lightning pen to add some more light surrounding the lightning bolts. I feel like it's just a bit too dark. And I could even pull out some little light rays that are peeking in between all the different clouds there. Now because I added all that light, I of course want to try to add some of that light to the water as well. And then next I'll go ahead and just fade that light out into the sky using intermediate blue colors. Because I don't really have a blender, this is really one of my only other options. So I'm kind of using this as if it's an airbrush. When it's really big like this, it actually works pretty well for that. And I'm using the gradient preset that is main color to transparent to do that with a very large brush. I'll just keep choosing intermediate colors here to transition it together, and that's just as good as blending. Now I want to add a new layer set to screen, and I'm going to use that to add some more glowing around the lightning bolts. If I overdo the glow, I can back down the opacity a bit. Then I'm going to return to the sky, and I think I want to make it just a bit darker behind the lightning bolts so that they stand out a bit more. And again, just try to soften and smooth out some of those transitions in color and overall clean up the sky. Now at this point it looks kind of cool like this. It's almost like an uninhabited wilderness, but I want to go ahead and add some lights here. So I'm going to do that on a separate layer set to screen. We'll make it look like there's a city on these hills, all kinds of different houses and buildings and cars and things. So I'm building up a little bit of form here and also kind of implying some lights and some little pockets of light. I'm using the glow knife for this. It is a little bit frustrating working with this brush because I want it to be really small, but it only goes so small and ends up kind of being a longer line than I want, but that's okay. I'll work with that. And I'll go ahead and add some more lights on another layer for those hills that are in the midground there. Just going back and forth between different sky colors and different yellow and orange colors. Now if I want to do some really tiny lights, I can use the lightning pen for that and just make a really, really small brush, and I can have some little circular lights there. Now because this is a night scene, I want to give it kind of a long exposure effect. So that means that the light will kind of streak like you see in certain kinds of photography. So let's say right around this bend here is a highway and the car's headlights and taillights are just creating a continuous line. So I'm trying to find the kind of look that I want using the glow knife for this, but I'm doing a lot of undos because I'm not getting exactly what I want. Again, the frustration is that this brush is too wide. So I'm going to go ahead and just scrap the glow knife, and I'm actually just going to use the lightning pen for this. Now to give the illusion of light, I want to set the composite method of this layer to screen. And I'm just going to use a bigger brush to create some bigger, broader glows on top of that. Now I want to reflect some of those lights into the water, especially the big ones. I don't need to do every single one. I'll go ahead and do that on a screen layer, and I'll just pull straight down using Shift and the lightning pen. That'll give me a nice vertical line like that. I'll also reflect some of those lights from the highway on the very bottom edge there. I don't need it to be too big of a reflection though. Then I'll add some more lights to the background on those distant hills, just very, very tiny little fine spots since they're so far away. Now I want to create some silhouettes of pine trees here along the edge of these foreground cliffs. I'll add a few lights here in the foreground as well. And then for the land in the foreground, I might put a little bit of rim highlight along the edge. That way some of that lightning bolt light that's reflecting off of it catches the edge there and helps it stand out. Next, I want to darken the bottom edge of the water a little bit, so I'll create a new layer. I'll set it to multiply, and I'll just use that lightning pen just to darken some areas here near the land. These could also be reflections or shadows from the land. Next, I'll go to one of my foreground layers here, and I'll go ahead and add in some more little lights and details along the highway and along the horizon here. Again, I'm using Shift with a very small brush to draw on those very thin horizontal lines. I don't want to get too big with the details there because I want them to look very small and very far away. Now, I've been a little bit sloppy about naming my layers. I have a bunch of unnamed layers here, so it's making it difficult to find what I'm looking for. So eventually I'm going to have to name some of my layers, but for now you can show and hide the eyeball to get an idea of what's on that layer. I'm going to go to that background distant lights layer, and I'm going to use the eraser now to erase from some of those shapes to help them look a little more detailed. Now at this point I know I've had some success with the lightning pen and the glow knife, but what the heck am I going to use this rotation jet for? I'm going to have to try to figure that out. So I've created a new layer here, testing a few strokes, trying to think about what they could be. Could they be lights in the distance, telephone poles, who knows? And it's really kind of an unruly brush, so it doesn't really make sense to try to use this for a horizontal line when I could just use the glow knife. So I'm just experimenting here to try to get some ideas. What can I use this for? I think I'm ultimately just going to use it for the sky here to put in some light rays that are emanating out. But I want to make sure that I'm a little bit more controlled about it when I put it in. So I'm going to make sure my color is not too bright. And I change the angle so those light rays are emanating out of the light source. I think that looks pretty decent. I'll also try using it to add a little bit of texture to the clouds, and I think that works all right. I can't say I like the line pattern, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and soften this to blend it a little bit, and then I won't see those heavy lines. Now I'm going to drop those texture layers onto the sky layer just to merge them together. Then I want to go ahead and just identify and name all of my layers here. That'll make it a lot easier to work now because then I won't have to search for the layers. Clicking the eyeball tool, I can just look visually and see that these are lights, these are hills, this is water, and so on. So I should have been doing this as I was going along, but since I'm just kind of improvising and making this up, I don't always know what layer I'm going to be painting on. So sometimes I just like to work this way. I create the layers first, put something on them, and then name them later when I know what it's going to be. So I'm just kind of cleaning up some of those edges a little bit with some more lights using the glow knife. I might even use that to add some contrast to the bottom edges of these little islands and peninsulas here in the water using a sky color. I'll go ahead and save a copy of my work, and I'll continue naming these unnamed layers so that I know what they are. Sometimes it can be helpful to flip your canvas horizontally. That gives you a fresh perspective on the piece. So I'm going to go ahead and work on it like this. I'll go to some of those background lights and use the eraser again just to kind of clean that up and bust up some of those shapes that I created earlier. I might also go ahead and soften the edges of those hills in the background using a soften filter, but I don't want to overdo it too much. I may want to soften the light layers as well. This really just helps this stuff look more distant, like it's in the background. Those light rays I created are a bit too sharp, so I'll just soften those as well, but not too much. Now I can go ahead and flip it back horizontally again. I think I like it flipped this way better, so I'll just leave it like that for now. Then I'll use the eraser to subtract from some of those reflections of the lights in the water. I think that looks pretty good. Now the edges of the hills look a little bit flat, so I'm going to go ahead and erase to create some distant pine tree effects here. That adds more character to the edges. I want those little details to be smaller and closer together in the distance, and they get bigger and more prominent as you move into the foreground. I feel like those distant lights are still a bit too cluttered and overdone, so I'm going to erase from them a little bit more. I also want to kind of darken the side of those distant hills using a gradient, so I'll just use a lightning pen for that, paint that on a separate layer, making sure that I don't paint outside of the hill shape by using a selection. That way I can control the opacity of that and just have it kind of fade out off there to the side. Now I think I want to return to the lightning bolt and just add a few more finer branches just to make it a bit more detailed. I can do that on that same lightning layer using the lightning pen and making sure that I have that correct gradient selected. I think the edge of the hill still needs more contrast, so on that sky layer where it meets the hills, I'll just lighten that a bit using the lightning pen. Again, that's light reflecting off of the hill. Now I'm going to go ahead and just do a little bit of blending. I want to soften the sky, but I don't want to soften the water, so I'm going to go ahead and create a rectangular selection of just the sky. I'll soften that a bit. Then I'll go ahead and select the water separately, and I'll go ahead and soften that with a different value. I think I want to darken the water a bit more, so I'm going to go to that side shadow layer that I used to darken the side of the hills, and I'll just use that lightning pen in a similar way to darken the water just a bit. I'm going to zoom out really far and make this tiny so that I can evaluate how it's coming along. Sometimes that gives you a good perspective on the progress of your piece. I think it's looking pretty good. So now I'm going to darken the sky a little bit by vignetting the edges up in the corners. That's kind of a chunky brush that I use there, so to smooth it out a bit, I'll just soften that a little bit. That helps blend it in. And I think I want to create a mask on that layer and just mask away some of the shadow using black to mask it away. And I'll soften it again after applying the mask. I'm also going to soften that horizon layer a little bit. That was a bit too sharp. And I'm going to soften some of those reflections of the light layers in the water, but I don't want to do it too much because I still want to have a little bit of detail there. Then I want to go ahead and soften the cliff foreground light layers. Those are a bit too sharp, so I'll soften those just a bit. Then I'm going to go ahead and zoom out again to evaluate and see how this is coming along. I think I need to darken the right edge of the sky and soften that just a bit. So I'm going to go to the canvas layer. Again, I'm going to use that lightning pen and just kind of try to pretend that it's an airbrush here. I'm going to make a selection of just the sky and blend just the sky again. Now each time I do that, I keep killing that nice sharp highlight I have separating the sky from the hills, so I'm going to have to put that in again. But this time I'm going to paint that on a new layer, that way if I soften the sky, I don't have to keep painting that in. And yet again, I'm going to erase some more of those distant lights because I still feel like it's a bit too cluttered. I can't seem to get enough highlights on the edges of my hills here, so I'm going to go through and add some more. We'll go ahead and add some more fine little lights here and there on these background hills, again using the lightning pen for that. And then next I want to add some highlights on the water. So I'm going to go ahead and just do that on this layer that's above everything else. Make sure that's set to screen and just use the lightning pen for that. Or I could also use the glow knife if I wanted to. And I'll go ahead and put in a few more distant lights as well using this nice bright yellow color. Next, I'll go ahead and refine the edge of the cloud by the lightning bolt. I'm using the lightning pen for that and making sure to use my main to transparent gradient. It works pretty well for that nice cloudy edge. I'll put in some little floaty bits of clouds here as well. And then next, I'll go ahead and make a selection of the hills in the background. And I want to lighten those a little bit with a little bit more mist. I'll do that on a new layer, and that'll help separate those foreground hills from the background hills. I think I'll also add some more glows for those lightning bolts because I feel like that little piece there off on the side doesn't have enough glow on it. I might have missed that earlier. And then I'm starting to get near the end here. I'm going to add a little bit more contrast on the edge of the cloud there using a lighter color. I might also soften the sky just a little bit more to smooth it out. Add a few more final details, and with that, I have a finished painting using only 3 brushes. If you enjoyed this lesson, check out some of my other Corel Painter tutorials and my other brush demos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.